The sun had not yet fully broken the horizon when the heavy silence of dawn began to break on the island of Saipan, in the Mariana Archipelago. It was July 7th, 1944. In the trenches and hastily dug foxholes, American soldiers from the 27th Infantry Division anxiously awaited the new attack that they knew would inevitably come. Many of them were already exhausted, covered in mud and sweat, their hands trembling more from tension than physical fatigue. Each breath was laden with the smell of gunpowder that permeated the air, mixed with the humidity of tropical vegetation and the permanent memory of spilled blood. The scene seemed suspended between two worlds, the momentary calm of dawn and the certainty that, at any moment, that calm would be shattered by uncontrollable violence. At the head of those men was Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien, commander of the 1st Battalion of the 105th Infantry Regiment. An imposing figure, he carried with him the experience of someone who had already faced war in its rawest form. At that moment, his firm fists held not one, but two Colt M1911A1 pistols, loaded with 45 ACP cartridges, a symbol of American industrial and military power. It was not just a matter of being armed, but of being confident in a weapon that had become an extension of the combat identity of the United States soldier. The goal, for him and for everyone entrenched on that line, was clear and brutal: to survive what was heralded as the largest Japanese suicide attack of the entire Pacific War. At 4:45 a.m., the earth began to shake beneath the men's feet. What at first sounded like a distant murmur quickly turned into a deafening roar. A collective chorus of Japanese voices, war cries echoing like thunder, rose from the shadows of the night, cutting through the darkness with a sound that the survivors would never forget. Thousands of Imperial Japanese Army soldiers, driven by desperate determination, launched themselves into a suicide attack known as a banzai charge. Officially, it was a last-ditch attempt to break through American lines and inflict devastating losses. In practice, it was an unstoppable human wave, armed with swords, bayonets, and pistols that, given the reality of the battlefield, seemed more like symbols than effective combat tools. At the head of that torrent of bodies were Japanese officers, wielding their katanas, blades that glinted in the uncertain light of dawn. Behind them came rows of soldiers with bayonet-mounted Arisaka rifles, followed by officers and non-commissioned officers carrying Type 14 Nambu pistols in their hands. These weapons, exotic to Western eyes, represented Japan's commitment to modernizing its arsenal of small arms. But as the ranks approached the American trenches, the fragility of their design and the cartridges they used would become evident. It was as if the Japanese had brought slingshots to a duel against steel sledgehammers. On the American side, each soldier checked his weapon once more, took a deep breath, and prepared to face the unimaginable. Some murmured prayers, others just gritted their teeth. The characteristic sound of bolts being pulled echoed between the trenches. But above all, there was a feeling that, unlike the Japanese, they had a silent trump card in their hands: the Colt M1911A1 pistol, designed for situations just like this, when the enemy broke through the line of fire and the fighting became chaotic, hand-to-hand combat, inches away. This pistol had its own history, marked by the name of John Moses Browning, the weapons engineering genius who designed it in the early 20th century. Its heavy slow-point 45 ACP cartridge was created for a specific purpose: to stop the enemy with a single shot. It didn't matter if the opponent was a fanatical Moro tribesman in the Philippines or a Japanese soldier immersed in suicidal fervor. The 230-grain bullet fired at 830 feet per second carried enough energy to knock a man down on the spot. The Americans' confidence lay not only in the colossal number of M1911A1s distributed by the Army, but in the certainty that when the finger pressed the trigger, the weapon would work. On the Japanese side, however, the situation was different. The 8x22mm Nambu cartridge fired by the Type 14 pistol looked sophisticated on paper, but in practice, it was too light to stop a determined enemy. Its 100-grain bullet could travel faster, but it lacked the mass necessary to deliver a decisive impact. Once the attack began, this theoretical difference would become a lethal one. The metaphor became literal. The Nambu was a slingshot, trying to compete with the Colt 45's devastating hammer. The banzai attack was preceded by a night of excess among the Japanese. Later accounts describe how imperial soldiers drank large quantities of sake and beer, aware that many of them would not see the next morning. This farewell ritual, laden with honor and fatalism, created an almost ritualistic atmosphere. They marched not only as warriors, but as men who had already accepted death as inevitable. This collective psychology gave the attack a frightening intensity. For the entrenched Americans, it was not just facing an armed enemy, but facing a horde of men who came with the certainty of death. However, Japanese courage would come up against an insurmountable barrier. The material, technological, and industrial difference that manifested itself with every shot. Lieutenant Colonel O'Brien was one of the first to open fire with his two M1911A1s. As Japanese screams filled the air, the deep, dry sound of the 45 ACP cut through the dawn. Each shot found a body, and each body fell immediately. It was the brutal translation of the concept of stopping power in action. Within seconds, the contrast between the two weapons became apparent. While the Japanese had to get dangerously close to strike with swords or bayonets, O'Brien and his men could take down each attacker before they reached the trenches. The scene was hellish. The human wave advanced, but with every meter gained, dozens of bodies were scattered on the ground. The shots from the M1911A1, with their precise and reliable cadence, echoed like relentless hammer blows against the onslaught. The weapon did not jam, did not fail, did not hesitate. In contrast, many Japanese officers who tried to use their Nambu pistols found that they jammed in the mud, that reloading became impossible amid the chaos, or that the impact of their shots was simply not enough to stop a determined enemy. This moment of clash between two different weapons reflected much more than a design choice. It was a portrait of the two nations at war. The United States, with its gigantic industry, had manufactured nearly 2 million M1911A1s during the conflict alone. Each standardized part, each mass-produced cartridge, reflected an industrial machine that functioned with almost mechanical precision. Japan, on the other hand, struggled with scarce resources, factories under constant bombardment, and a production that, in almost 20 years, had barely reached 400,000 Nambu pistols. This disparity was not only numerical, it was existential. As the banzai attack intensified, the metaphor came to life before the eyes of the combatants. The Nambu, with its mechanical fragility and limited ammunition, seemed literally like a toy in the face of the overwhelming power of the Colt 45. It was the difference between trying to stop an avalanche with small stones or with a wall of steel. Each shot from the M1911A1 represented not only an act of defense, but also the embodiment of American industrial and technological superiority. When the sun finally began to break over the horizon, illuminating the devastated fields of Saipan, the landscape revealed the result of that brutal clash. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay before the American trenches, many of them fallen under the impact of 45 bullets. For the survivors, both American and Japanese, the lesson was clear. On the battlefield, courage and fanaticism were no substitute for the effectiveness of a weapon designed and tested for the precise function of stopping the enemy. The Nambu Type 14 may have carried the aura of Japanese pride, but on that dawn in Saipan, it had proven fragile, almost useless, a poorly armed slingshot against the American steel sledgehammer. The attack on July 7, 1944, would go down in history as the greatest banzai of the war, but also as one of the moments that crystallized the fundamental difference between two nations, one that placed its hope in the indomitable spirit of its soldiers, and another that combined that spirit with the overwhelming force of an unsurpassed technological arsenal. On that day, the Colt M1911A1 became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of American confidence amid chaos, while the ineffective and limited Nambu became a portrait of the contradictions of an empire that tried to challenge modernity with weapons that were already obsolete. When we talk about weapons that marked not only battles but entire eras, few carry as much historical weight as the Colt M1911A1. Its presence in the Pacific in 1944 was no accident, but the result of more than 3 decades of evolution in military weaponry, battles fought, and lessons learned at the cost of blood. For the men of the 27th Infantry Division in Saipan, for the Marines in Guadalcanal, or for the soldiers who would face Iwo Jima and Okinawa, this pistol was not just a tool, but an extension of their very survival. And what is most impressive is that its history began long before those distant islands became synonymous with brutal combat. The year was 1911 when the United States Army officially adopted the pistol designed by John Moses Browning. That name was already revered in the firearms industry, but it was with the Colt M1911 that he left an indelible mark on the military world. The motivation for this project dated back to the bitter experience of the Philippine War in the early 20th century, when American soldiers discovered that the .38 long Colt revolvers they carried were simply incapable of stopping determined enemies, such as the Moro warriors, who continued to advance even after being shot several times. This collective trauma led to a very clear military requirement. The United States needed a handgun capable of stopping any opponent with a single shot. Nothing less would be acceptable. It was in this context that the .45 ACP cartridge, short for automatic Colt pistol, was born. Developed in conjunction with the new pistol, it represented a radically different philosophy from that of lighter calibers. While other armies were betting on faster and smaller projectiles, the Americans decided to invest in a large, heavy, slow, but relentless bullet. The result was a 230-grain cartridge, capable of being fired at 830 feet per second, with enough energy to immediately take down any enemy. The math was simple and devastating. The combination of high mass and moderate velocity produced an impact that did not pass through the body and lose itself beyond the target, but remained in it, transferring all its energy at the point of impact. This concept, called stopping power, would become synonymous with the Colt 45. When World War I broke out, the M1911 was already in service. In the muddy fields of France, it proved to be an indispensable ally for soldiers who, on many occasions, faced combat in trenches and hand-to-hand attacks. Its robustness, reliability, and devastating power made it remembered as one of the great weapons of that conflict. So, when World War II began, there was no question. The M1911A1, a refined version of the original model, would be mass-produced and distributed to all U.S. armed forces. In the Pacific, the pistol took center stage. Unlike the European front, marked by long distances and tanks advancing across fields, combat on the Japanese islands was intimate, brutal, and suffocating. Dense jungles, fortified caves, narrow villages, and makeshift trenches turned every battle into a potential hand-to-hand combat. In these circumstances, the M1 Garand rifle, although excellent in open fields, was sometimes too long and difficult to handle. That's where the Colt 45 took center stage. American factories produced the M1911A1 on an unprecedented scale. More than 1.8 million units were manufactured during the war alone, in an effort that mobilized not only Colt, but also companies such as Remington Rand, the Ithaca Gun Company, Union Switch and Signal, and even Singer, famous for its sewing machines. The fact that a company dedicated to sewing fabrics was able, even for a brief period, to produce combat pistols reflects the industrial power of the United States. In contrast, Japan struggled to keep its small arms production lines running in the face of shortages of steel, energy, and skilled labor. This mass production did not sacrifice quality. On the contrary, the model maintained a standard of reliability that is still impressive today. All parts were interchangeable between different manufacturers, which meant that a soldier in Iwo Jima could repair his weapon with parts from any factory without worrying about specific adjustments. The Parkerized finish replaced the old bluing process, ensuring greater resistance to corrosion in tropical and humid environments. The grips, previously made of wood, were now made of plastic, speeding up production without compromising usability. Every detail showed how American industry had managed to combine speed, volume, and quality in a single equation. But the Colt was not just an engineering triumph. It was also a weapon that inspired psychological confidence. Soldiers knew that if their machine guns jammed or their rifles ran out of ammunition, the M1911A1 would be there, ready as a last resort. This confidence was not theoretical, it was practical. Field reports describe soldiers who, in the midst of chaos, drew their pistols and managed to repel attacks at such close range that they could see their enemy's eyes. And in those moments, the difference between the .45 ACP cartridge and lighter ammunition was the difference between surviving and not returning home. Each shot from the Colt resonated with a deep, full-bodied sound, unmistakable amid the noise of battle. It was a signature sound that quickly became associated with instant death. Japanese soldiers who survived the fighting reported the instinctive fear they felt when they heard that sound. The Colt not only killed physically, but also undermined the morale of the enemy. It was the embodiment of a myth, that of a weapon that never failed, that never left the soldier alone. The battles in the Pacific were witness to this. In Guadalcanal, When Japanese soldiers broke through the lines and charged the American officer's command post, it was Colt pistols that repelled the attack. At Iwo Jima, where volcanic dust choked weapons and men, the Colt continued to fire when other weapons jammed. At Okinawa, one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, the pistol was decisive in combat in caves and villages, where narrow corridors and extreme proximity nullified the advantage of rifles. Confidence in the M1911A1 was even reflected in the allocation numbers. The Marine Corps significantly increased the authorized number of pistols per division from 798 in 1942 to over 1,700 in 1945. This was not a logistical detail. It was an official recognition that in the Pacific, the pistol was not an accessory, but an essential weapon. Officers, sergeants, tank crews, gunners, and even support teams knew that at some point they might need it. The most curious thing is that this confidence was not based solely on statistics or command orders, but on real stories that circulated among the troops. Stories such as that of William O'Brien, who unloaded his Colt pistols against the wave of Japanese troops in Saipan, or that of Tom Baker, who used his M1911A1 as a last defense before falling, were passed on, increasing respect for the weapon. These accounts transformed the Colt into something more than metal and gunpowder. They made it part of the collective spirit of survival. And when we observe this phenomenon from a distance, we understand that the Colt represented much more than just a weapon. It symbolized the industrial strength of the United States, the ability to transform resources into effective products on an unimaginable scale. It was the portrait of a nation that understood that winning a war depended not only on the bravery of its soldiers, but on the combination of bravery and the right tools for them to survive. This view contrasted sharply with the Japanese experience, which, as we shall see, relied on weapons that did not meet the demands of modern warfare. While the Nambu malfunctioned, jammed, and fired projectiles that were too light, the Colt remained steadfast, reliable, and devastating. In each confrontation, this difference became clearer, and when thousands of individual confrontations are added up, the difference translates into strategic superiority, battles won, and war decided. That's why, when we look at the M1911A1, we see it not only as a weapon of the past, but as a milestone of an era in which intelligent design, mass production, and practical application came together in near perfection. It was not just combat equipment. It was a bond of trust between the soldier and his destiny. And it is precisely this trust that explains why, even today, the Colt 45 continues to be remembered as one of the most respected weapons in history. Consider taking a quick break to subscribe and not miss the next revelations in this narrative. That said, speaking now about the scenario in the Pacific, amid mud, blood, and volcanic dust, the M1911A1 established itself as a symbol of American superiority, not only because it was efficient, but because it never failed to fulfill the function for which it was created: to give the soldier the certainty that at the most critical moment, he would not be unarmed in the face of the enemy. That confidence, more than any production number or technical specification, was what turned the Colt 45 into a legend. If the Colt M1911A1 represented the unshakable confidence of American soldiers, the Nambu Type 14 pistol was a reflection of the opposite reality, marked by design limitations, misguided doctrinal choices, and profound industrial constraints. To understand why the Nambu ended up being remembered as a slingshot compared to the warhammer that was the Colt 45, it is necessary to look at its origin, its technical design, and, above all, the way it was used on the battlefields of the Pacific. In the decades leading up to World War II, Japan sought to modernize its armed forces to keep pace with the great Western powers. This process, which began in the Meiji era, aimed to bring the nation to the same technological level as the United States and Europe. In the field of small arms, modernization resulted in the development of the Nambu family of pistols, created by engineer Kijiro Nambu, considered by many to be the Japanese John Browning. However, this comparison is largely unfair. While Browning delivered refined and functionally superior designs, Nambu's creations, although ingenious, had flaws that would prove fatal in actual combat. The Nambu Type 14, introduced in 1926, was born as an attempt to standardize the armament of Japanese officers with a modern semi-automatic pistol. The design was peculiar and drew attention for its elongated appearance, vaguely reminiscent of the German Luger P-08. It was an open-bolt pistol with a 4.6-inch barrel and an 8-round magazine. At first glance, it seemed to be on par with Western weapons. But reality would soon show that appearances were deceiving. The first problem lay at the heart of any firearm: its ammunition. The 8x22mm Nambu cartridge was designed specifically for this pistol. It was a light projectile, weighing only 100 grains, fired at about 300 meters per second. Although the velocity was reasonable, the lack of mass resulted in insufficient kinetic energy. This translated into a weak impact, unable to immediately stop a determined enemy. In direct comparison, the .45 ACP cartridge fired by the Colt M1911A1 had more than twice the mass, and even with lower velocity, its transferred energy was devastating. In practice, while the Colt could take down an enemy with a single shot to the torso, the Nambu often required multiple shots to vital points to achieve the same effect. A luxury that a Japanese officer rarely had in the chaos of battle. In addition to its ballistic weakness, the Nambu cartridge had another serious problem: its total incompatibility with any other ammunition used by military forces around the world. It was an isolated cartridge with a unique design, which made its production and logistics extremely complicated. This meant that once supply lines were cut, Japanese officers quickly ran out of usable ammunition. There was no way to adapt or replace it with captured cartridges, as was the case with some weapons of other calibers. This exclusivity, which might seem like a technical detail, proved to be a death sentence in a scenario where the United States controlled the air and sea, constantly intercepting Japanese shipments. In the design of the pistol itself, the flaws multiplied. The safety device was perhaps the most notorious of these. Located above the trigger guard, it required the use of both hands to be activated. In other words, in a real combat situation, where seconds meant the difference between life and death, the officer had to drop his rifle, hold the pistol, and, with his other hand, release the lock. This absurd requirement made the weapon slow to prepare, and therefore ineffective in surprise situations. Unlike the Colt, whose safety lock could be manipulated with the thumb, without removing the weapon from the firing position, the Nambu was almost an invitation to failure. Another critical detail was the magazine system. The Nambu Type 14 had an 8-round magazine, but its spring was so fragile that it often failed to feed the cartridges properly. This resulted in feeding failures, jams, and malfunctions at decisive moments. And, as if that weren't enough, the internal design was so sensitive to dirt and moisture that contact with mud or sand was enough to compromise its operation. To make matters worse, the weapon had no bolt retention system after the last shot. Thus, the shooter did not know immediately when the magazine was empty, which, in combat, meant precious seconds wasted trying to fire a pistol that was already unloaded. There was also the infamous magazine disconnect system. This device prevented the pistol from firing if the magazine was removed. The idea was to serve as a safety measure. In practice, it turned the weapon into a useless weight if the magazine was lost, damaged, or even if the soldier tried to fire the last cartridge still in the chamber. In comparison, the Colt M1911A1 could be fired even without a magazine, as long as there was a bullet in the chamber. This simple detail could save a life. For the Japanese, it meant yet another limitation that rendered their pistol ineffective in adverse conditions. The cost was also a factor. Although cheaper than previous models in the Nambu family, the pistol cost 78 yen, a significant amount for an officer. For comparison, it was almost half a month's salary. This meant that, in many cases, Japanese officers had to pay for their own weapons, which made them less accessible. The United States, on the other hand, equipped its officers in a standardized manner, ensuring that everyone had access to the Colt 45 at no individual cost. This difference in policy reflected the structural discrepancy between the two forces. From an industrial standpoint, Nambu's production also revealed Japan's limitations. From 1926 until the end of the war, about 400,000 pistols were manufactured. This number, although significant, was negligible when compared to American production of nearly 2 million Colt M1911A1s during the war years alone. In addition, the quality of Japanese manufacturing declined sharply as the war progressed. In the beginning, the pistols were well finished, with carved wood and acceptable tolerances. But by the end of the war, already under the devastating effects of Allied bombing, production was transferred to makeshift factories, such as Torimatsu's. The result was pistols with rough finishes, poorly cut wooden grips, or even flat pieces without grooves, and tolerances so tight that they jammed easily. These flaws did not go unnoticed by American soldiers. Many veterans reported that when they captured a Nambu pistol, they immediately noticed its inferiority. Some even considered it dangerous for those who used it, due to the risk of malfunction. Not surprisingly, the pistol would become a highly prized war trophy, not for what it could do in combat, but precisely because it was a symbol of the defeated enemy. For American soldiers, the Nambu was a souvenir, an exotic object, but never a reliable weapon. The contrast was evident in the field. While the Colt M1911A1 could be submerged in mud, buried in sand, or wet with salt water and still continue to function, the Nambu often became unusable under the same conditions. And in the Pacific Islands, where the environment was unforgiving, this difference had deadly consequences. It is important to remember that, for the Japanese, the pistol was not seen as a frontline combat weapon, but as a status symbol. Many officers carried it more as a badge of command than as a practical instrument of war. Japanese doctrine emphasized the use of the sword and bayonet, legacies of a martial culture that valued hand-to-hand combat and warrior spirit over technology. This mentality, while admirable in its devotion to tradition, proved completely inadequate in the modern reality of industrialized warfare. This emphasis on spirit over matter is what led, in large part, to situations such as those seen in Saipan. While the Americans faced the Banzai attack confident in their Colt pistols, the Japanese advanced wielding weapons that were not up to the task. The result was predictable. Hundreds of soldiers fell before even reaching the enemy trenches, victims of a technological gap that turned bravery into futile sacrifice. As the war progressed, Japan tried to adjust Nambu's production to address its limitations. But it was too late. Material shortages, declining industrial quality, and the constant pressure of total war made any improvement impossible. The last units manufactured, already in 1945, were of such low quality that they could hardly be considered reliable weapons. They were testimonies to the decline of a power that could no longer sustain the weight of war. The legacy of the Nambu Type 14 is therefore paradoxical. On the one hand, it represents Japan's effort to modernize and create standardized national weaponry. On the other, it symbolizes the inability to compete with the great powers in terms of design, production, and combat effectiveness. The metaphor of the slingshot versus the hammer finds its perfect expression here. A weapon that, although functional in theory, proved powerless in the face of the brutality of actual warfare. In the end, the Nambu was surpassed not only by the power of Colt's 45 ACP cartridge, but also by the philosophy behind it. While the United States understood that modern warfare required reliable, powerful, mass-produced weapons, Japan still insisted on doctrines that valued fighting spirit over the effectiveness of equipment. This contrast proved costly. It cost thousands of lives in suicide attacks that never had a real chance of success. It cost the illusion that courage could replace steel. The story of the Nambu Type 14 is, ultimately, the story of a weapon that was born obsolete, served as a status symbol rather than a practical tool, and ended the war as an exotic souvenir in the hands of the enemies who defeated it. A slingshot, elegant perhaps, but useless in the face of the industrial and technological sledgehammer represented by the Colt M1911A1. The attack on Saipan in July 1944 was not just another bloody episode in the Pacific War. It became a crystallization point, a visible symbol of the difference between two nations, their combat philosophies, and their ability to sustain modern warfare. There, in the face of the largest Banzai attack of the entire war, two worlds collided. On one side was Japan, pushing its men to their deaths in human waves, armed with Arisaka rifles, samurai swords, and Nambu Type 14 pistols that looked like fragile objects amid the chaos. On the other, the United States, which, in addition to morale and military discipline, carried in its hands one of the most successful designs in the history of firearms. The Colt M1911A1. And it was in this clash that it became impossible to ignore the disparity between the Japanese slingshot and the American hammer. The image of Lieutenant Colonel William O'Brien emptying two Colt 45 pistols against a wave of enemies dramatically illustrates the power of a weapon designed to be effective. Each shot immediately knocked down an attacker, and O'Brien's confidence in the robustness of his weaponry allowed him to continue fighting even after being seriously wounded. Around him, dozens of Japanese bodies fell, living testimony to the devastating stopping power of the .45 ACP cartridge. His heroic resistance not only bought time for his men to retreat, but also demonstrated in practice what the statistics had already announced. The Colt was a weapon designed to survive any scenario, including the wildest suicide charge. This was not an isolated case. The story of Tom Baker, the soldier who, unable to move, was left by his comrades leaning against a tree with a loaded M1911A1, brutally sums up the role of the pistol in war. When his comrades returned after the battle, they found Baker dead, his gun empty, next to 8 Japanese bodies lying in a circle around him. Each shot had found its target. Each bullet had fulfilled exactly the purpose for which it was designed: to stop the enemy immediately. The scene, almost cinematic, became part of military legend. But more than that, it represented in an indisputable way how the correct design of a weapon can transform a last act of desperation into effective resistance until the end. These reports spread across the battlefields of the Pacific and reached the barracks and command offices, fueling the perception that the M1911A1 was not only efficient but indispensable. In Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the deep sound of the Colt's firing echoed like a constant reminder of American superiority. Japanese officers who survived hand-to-hand combat later reported the psychological impact the weapon had. The deep, characteristic boom of the .45 ACP was quickly associated with instant death, striking fear even among soldiers who had accepted their own mortality. This psychological dimension should not be underestimated. A weapon is not only what it does physically, but what it represents to those who face it. In this respect, the Colt became a true symbol of American inevitability in the Pacific. Documents captured from the Japanese reinforce this perception. Officers' diaries describe the respect they had for American power and the arsenal they faced. One of them, recovered in the Gilbert Islands in 1943, reported that the soldiers knew they were doomed, but still could not help noticing the disparity in equipment. Carrying backpacks weighing almost 90% of their body weight, wielding fragile weapons and cartridges of dubious impact, they marched against enemies supplied by an industrial machine that seemed to have no end. It was as if they were fighting against a wall that was rebuilt every day, while they themselves saw their weapons become increasingly rudimentary. The contrast between the Colt and the Nambu was also evident in training. Americans received detailed instruction in pistol shooting, with an emphasis on accuracy and the use of the weapon as a last resort in close combat. The M1911A1's light and consistent trigger facilitated accuracy, and its sturdy solid steel construction helped control recoil, allowing for quick and accurate shots. On the Japanese side, pistol training was minimal. Officers were instructed to use it more as a symbol of authority than as an actual tool of war. The emphasis was on the use of the sword, the rifle with bayonet, and even hand-to-hand combat tactics. It was a philosophy that, while honorable in its fidelity to warrior traditions, proved disastrous against an enemy equipped with weapons designed to eliminate the opponent before he could even get close. Modern warfare had no room for romanticism. In the caves of Okinawa, on the volcanic beaches of Iwo Jima, and in the fields of Saipan, the Colt 45 showed that a heavy, slow bullet could decide battles when fired from a weapon that simply did not fail. The Nambu, on the other hand, jammed, fired projectiles that were too light and depended on near-ideal conditions to function. And conditions in the Pacific were far from ideal. Mud, sand, sea air, and dust were relentless enemies of any weapon. The Colt thrived in these conditions. The Nambu succumbed to them. By the end of the war, the difference had become impossible to ignore. While the United States had produced nearly 2 million M1911A1 pistols in just 4 years, Japan had barely reached 400,000 Nambu units in nearly 2 decades. And yet, the quality of Japanese pistols declined rapidly as the war progressed. In late 1944 and early 1945, pistols produced in makeshift factories featured poorly finished grips, parts that did not fit together properly, and tolerances so tight that they failed in harsh environments. Some models were even made of plain wood without grooves, a testament to the lack of resources and the pressure of total war. This industrial gap was more than a technical detail. It represented the fate of 2 nations. Japan, still dependent on limited resources, was trying to sustain a war against enemies who could produce weapons in quantities and qualities that were simply unparalleled. The Nambu was a reflection of this dilemma. A weapon designed to be modern, but which in practice never lived up to the demands of war. Colt, on the other hand, was a reflection of a nation capable of transforming ideas into effective products and distributing them on a massive scale. The legacy of this disparity extended far beyond 1945. When the war ended, thousands of Nambu pistols were taken back by American soldiers as trophies. They became exotic souvenirs, curiosities kept in cabinets, or displayed as symbols of victory. The Colt M1911A1, on the other hand, remained in service for decades through the Korean War and Vietnam, and remained in use until it was officially replaced by the Beretta M9 in 1985. Even so, American Special Forces continued to use .45 pistols because they recognized that, in close combat, the stopping power of the cartridge remained unbeatable. Today, looking back, it is not difficult to see why the M1911A1 became an icon and the Nambu a footnote. The former was a symbol of reliability, power, and confidence. The latter was a symbol of limitations, failures, and shattered illusions. In Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, this difference was not just statistical. It was measured in lives saved and lives lost, in battles won and inevitable defeats. It was measured in the moment when an American soldier pulled the trigger and was sure his weapon would fire, while a Japanese officer in a similar situation could not have the same confidence. The story of Colt versus Nambu is, ultimately, the story of the Pacific War itself. A nation that valued the warrior spirit above all else found itself crushed by a nation that combined courage and technology, tradition and innovation, bravery and mass production. In the clash between the slingshot and the hammer, the outcome could only be one. The hammer triumphed, and with it the inexorable logic of industrialized warfare. What could have been different? Would Japan have met a different fate if it had invested in more effective weapons, more robust logistics, and more modern training? Or, given the industrial and technological power of the United States, was defeat inevitable, regardless of the choices made? That question remains open, and we need your opinion on it. Comment on your analytical view, and let's discuss it further. Like, share, subscribe to the channel, and be sure to comment. Your opinion enriches the debate and keeps the memory of these events alive.